The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as hundreds of mourners gathered for General Robert Harrison's funeral. The distinguished officer had served his country for over 40 years, earning respect from presidents and privates alike. His casket, draped in the American flag, sat surrounded by an honor guard as military personnel and dignitaries took their designated seats. Lieutenant Michael Stevens stood at his assigned post near the entrance, his uniform crisp and his demeanor professional. At 26, he had been in the Army for only 4 years, but he took his duties seriously. Today's assignment was particularly important, ensuring only authorized personnel entered the restricted area near the general's casket. As the ceremony began, Stevens noticed an elderly man approaching the cordoned-off section. The stranger appeared to be in his 80s, walking slowly with the aid of a wooden cane. His clothes were clean but worn, a simple gray suit that had seen better days, scuffed black shoes, and a faded tie that might have been navy blue decades ago. What caught Stevens's attention most was the man's determined expression as he moved purposefully toward the front of the gathering. The lieutenant stepped forward, his hand raised in a polite but firm gesture. "Excuse me, sir," he said, keeping his voice respectful but authoritative. "This area is restricted to family members and high-ranking officials only. You'll need to take a seat in the general seating area." The elderly man paused, looking up at the young officer with tired but clear blue eyes. "Son, I need to be up there," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight tremor that came with age. "General Harrison was my friend." Stevens had heard similar claims throughout the morning. Many attendees wanted to get closer to pay their final respects, and it was his job to maintain order. "I understand your desire to honor the general, sir, but I have strict orders. Only those on the authorized list can proceed beyond this point. May I see your identification and invitation?" The old man reached into his jacket pocket with shaking hands, producing a worn wallet. He fumbled through it for a moment before pulling out a driver's license. Stevens examined it carefully. James Morrison, age 82, with an address in a small town about 50 miles away. The lieutenant checked his clipboard containing the names of approved attendees, running his finger down the alphabetical list. Morrison's name was nowhere to be found. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison, but your name isn't on the list," Stevens explained, handing back the license. "You're welcome to participate in the ceremony from the general seating area. There are still some good spots available where you can pay your respects." Morrison's shoulders sagged slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "Lieutenant, you don't understand. Bob Harrison and I go back a long way. We served together in Korea. I promised him I'd be there when his time came, and I intend to keep that promise." Stevens felt a pang of sympathy for the old veteran, but rules were rules. Military funerals required strict protocol, especially for someone of General Harrison's stature. Security concerns, seating arrangements, and ceremonial procedures all had to be followed precisely. "Sir, I appreciate your service and your friendship with the general, but I cannot allow unauthorized personnel in the restricted area. It's not personal, it's military protocol." The conversation had drawn the attention of several nearby attendees. Some watched with curiosity, while others seemed annoyed by the delay. Stevens was acutely aware that the ceremony was about to begin, and he needed to resolve this situation quickly without causing a scene that might disrupt the solemn proceedings. Morrison stood his ground, leaning heavily on his cane. "Son, I drove 3 hours to be here today. I haven't seen Bob in 15 years, but we wrote letters every Christmas. He saved my life in Seoul, and I saved his in Busan. We made a pact that whoever outlived the other would make sure the survivor got a proper send-off." The lieutenant's training kicked in. He had been taught to be firm but respectful, especially with elderly veterans. However, he also knew that allowing one person to break protocol could lead to chaos. Other mourners might demand similar exceptions, and the carefully orchestrated ceremony could descend into disorder. "Mr. Morrison, "I truly respect your service and your friendship with General Harrison," Stevens said, his voice softening slightly while maintaining its firmness. "But I have my orders. The restricted area is reserved for immediate family members and military personnel of specific ranks. I'm sure the general would understand that military protocol must be followed. Even at his own funeral." The elderly man's eyes filled with tears, though he tried to maintain his composure. "That boy doesn't know what he's saying," Morrison muttered, more to himself than to Stevens. "Bob would roll over in his casket if he knew I was being turned away." As the honor guard began to position themselves for the flag-folding ceremony, Stevens realized he needed to end this confrontation. The last thing he wanted was for this elderly veteran to cause a disruption during such a sacred moment. "Sir, please take a seat in the general area. I promise you'll have a clear view of the proceedings, and you can pay your respects appropriately from there." Morrison looked past Stevens toward the casket, his weathered face showing a mixture of grief and frustration. The old soldier understood military hierarchy and protocol better than most, having lived it for decades. Yet something deep inside him rebelled against the idea of honoring his fallen friend from a distance, relegated to the back rows like a stranger who had merely read about the general in newspapers. "I suppose you're just doing your job," Morrison said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "But mark my words, young man. There are things more important than lists and protocols. Sometimes the heart knows truths that paperwork cannot capture." As Morrison began to turn away, defeated but dignified, neither he nor Lieutenant Stevens could have predicted that their encounter was about to take a dramatic turn that would leave everyone in attendance stunned and questioning everything they thought they knew about honor, friendship, and the true meaning of military service. As Morrison slowly turned to walk toward the general seating area, a commanding voice cut through the murmur of the gathered crowd. "Lieutenant Stevens, what seems to be the problem here?" Stevens snapped to attention as he recognized the voice of General Patricia Walsh, a four-star general known throughout the military for her no-nonsense approach and keen intellect. She approached with measured steps, her numerous ribbons and medals catching the morning sunlight. Walsh had earned her rank through decades of distinguished service, including combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and her presence commanded immediate respect from everyone present. "General Walsh, ma'am," Stevens saluted crisply. "I was explaining to this gentleman that the restricted area is limited to authorized personnel only. His name doesn't appear on the approved list." General Walsh's sharp eyes studied Morrison, taking in his worn suit, his veteran's bearing despite his age, and the unmistakable look of a soldier who had seen combat. Something in the old man's posture and demeanor triggered her curiosity. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts about people, and every instinct told her there was more to this story. "What's your name, sir?" Walsh asked Morrison directly, her tone respectful but probing. "James Morrison, ma'am," the elderly man replied, straightening slightly despite his cane. "I served with General Harrison in Korea 2nd Infantry Division. We were both sergeants then, just kids, really, trying to stay alive and keep our men safe." Walsh's eyebrows raised slightly. She was well versed in military history and knew that General Harrison had indeed served as an enlisted man in Korea before working his way up through the ranks. It was one of the things that had made him such an effective leader. He understood the military from the ground up. "You served together in Korea?" Walsh asked, her interest clearly piqued. "Tell me about it." Morrison glanced nervously at Lieutenant Stevens, who was watching the exchange with growing confusion. The elderly veteran seemed to gather strength from Walsh's genuine interest. "We were at Heartbreak Ridge in October 1951. Bob and I were squad leaders in different platoons, but we ended up pinned down together when the Chinese launched a counterattack. Spent 2 days in a foxhole, sharing water and ammunition, watching each other's backs." The general's expression grew more attentive. Heartbreak Ridge was a significant battle in Korean War history, one that few people outside military circles would know about in such detail. "Continue," she encouraged. "Bob took shrapnel in his leg on the second day," Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger as the memories flooded back. "Chinese were advancing, and he couldn't move fast enough. I could have made it to safety alone, but I wasn't leaving my buddy behind. Carried him half a mile under fire until we reached our lines." Lieutenant Stevens listened with growing amazement, but he still felt bound by his duty. "General Walsh, regardless of Mr. Morrison's service record, the protocol clearly states—" Walsh held up a hand, silencing the lieutenant without taking her eyes off Morrison. "And what happened after Korea, Mr. Morrison?" "Bob got commissioned when we came home. Smart as a whip, that boy was. Always reading, always thinking ahead. Me, I did my 20 and got out, became a mechanic. But we stayed in touch. Christmas cards, letters when something big happened. His wedding, his promotions, my wife's funeral 5 years ago. He never forgot where he came from or the people who served alongside him." The elderly man's voice cracked slightly as he continued. "3 months ago, I got a call from his aide. Bob was in the hospital and he wanted to talk to me. Weak as he was, he made me promise I'd be here today. Said he wanted his old foxhole buddy to see him off properly." General Walsh felt a chill run down her spine. She had known General Harrison well, had served under his command early in her career. He had indeed been the type of leader who never forgot his roots or the people who had shaped his character. If this man's story was true, and every detail suggested it was, then a grave injustice was being committed. "Lieutenant Stevens," Walsh said, her voice taking on the steel that had made her famous throughout the military. "Are you familiar with the concept of brotherhood in arms?" "Yes, ma'am," Stevens replied, though his confusion was evident. "It refers to the bonds formed between soldiers who serve together in combat." "That's the textbook definition," Walsh said. "But the reality goes much deeper. The man standing before you didn't just serve with General Harrison. He saved his life. Without Mr. Morrison's courage at Heartbreak Ridge, there would be no General Harrison to bury today. Do you understand the significance of that?" Stevens felt his certainty beginning to waver. He looked at Morrison with new eyes, seeing not just an elderly man in a worn suit, but a hero whose actions had shaped military history. Yet his training and sense of duty held firm. "General Walsh, I understand the importance of their relationship, but my orders were very specific. Only personnel on the authorized list." "Your orders," Walsh interrupted, her voice rising slightly, "were to ensure appropriate security and maintain the dignity of this ceremony. Tell me, Lieutenant, what could be more appropriate than having General Harrison's oldest military friend present to honor his memory? What could be more dignified than recognizing the man who made the general's distinguished career possible?" The conversation had drawn a crowd of onlookers, including several high-ranking officers and members of General Harrison's family. Stevens felt the weight of their attention and the growing realization that he might be making a serious mistake. However, his sense of duty remained strong. "Ma'am, I appreciate the historical significance of Mr. Morrison's service, but protocol exists for important reasons. Security, order, proper ceremony procedures." "Protocol," Walsh said, her voice now carrying the full authority of her rank, "serves the mission, Lieutenant. It does not supersede honor, decency, or the fundamental values that make us who we are as military professionals. When protocol conflicts with doing what is right, a true leader finds a way to honor both." Morrison watched the exchange with growing discomfort. "General Walsh, I don't want to cause any trouble. If my being here creates problems—" "Mr. Morrison," Walsh said firmly, turning to address him directly, "you belong here more than most of the people in this cemetery today. Your presence isn't the problem. The problem is a rigid interpretation of rules that ignores the spirit of what we're here to do." She turned back to Stevens, her expression serious but not unkind. "Lieutenant, I'm going to give you an opportunity to reconsider your position. Sometimes leadership means understanding that the letter of the law must bend to accommodate the spirit of justice. General Harrison would want his friend here. I'm certain of that." Stevens found himself at a crossroads. His training told him to follow orders strictly, but his growing understanding of the situation suggested that blindly following protocol might be the wrong course of action. The weight of General Walsh's authority pressed down on him, along with the knowledge that this decision would likely define how he was remembered by everyone present. As he struggled with his choice, neither Stevens nor anyone else in the gathering could have anticipated that the most dramatic moment was yet to come, and that the resolution of this conflict would teach everyone present a lesson about the true meaning of military honor and friendship. Before Lieutenant Stevens could respond to General Walsh's challenge, another voice joined the conversation, one that carried even more weight and authority. "What's the delay here? We need to begin the ceremony." Everyone turned to see General William Crawford approaching, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. His presence immediately elevated the tension of the situation. Crawford was known for his decisive leadership and his intolerance for anything that disrupted military precision and protocol. General Walsh quickly briefed Crawford on the situation, explaining Morrison's relationship with General Harrison and the lieutenant's adherence to the restricted access list. Crawford listened intently, his expression unreadable as he absorbed the details of the conflict. "So, let me understand this correctly," Crawford said, his voice carrying across the immediate area and drawing even more attention. "We have a veteran who saved General Harrison's life in Korea, who maintained a friendship with him for 70 years, who was personally invited by the deceased to attend this funeral, and we're preventing him from paying his final respects because his name isn't on a piece of paper?" Lieutenant Stevens felt the ground shifting beneath him. The involvement of the nation's top military officer had transformed what began as a simple protocol enforcement into something much larger. "Sir, I was following my orders to maintain security and ensure only authorized personnel—" "Lieutenant," Crawford interrupted, his tone sharp but not hostile. "I want you to think carefully about what those orders actually mean. Security from what? Are you suggesting that an 82-year-old veteran poses a threat to this ceremony?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Stevens realized that his rigid interpretation of the rules was beginning to look foolish rather than dutiful. However, his sense of military discipline remained strong. "No, sir, but the list exists for a reason. If we make exceptions for what's right and honorable," Crawford said, his voice rising, "then we demonstrate that the military serves something greater than bureaucracy. Mr. Morrison, please step forward." The elderly veteran approached cautiously, clearly overwhelmed by the attention from such high-ranking officers. Crawford studied him with the same intensity he might apply to a strategic military decision. "Tell me about Heartbreak Ridge," Crawford commanded. Morrison's voice grew steady as he recounted the battle, describing tactical details that only someone who had been there could know. He spoke of the Chinese night attacks, the artillery bombardments, the desperate fight to hold strategic positions. His account was precise, emotional, and unmistakably authentic. "And General Harrison?" Crawford prompted. "Bob was always thinking ahead, even as a sergeant," Morrison explained. "When the Chinese broke through our right flank, he organized a fighting withdrawal that saved half our company. That's when he took the shrapnel. I couldn't leave him. He'd have done the same for me." Crawford nodded slowly. He had read enough combat reports and spoken with enough veterans to recognize the truth when he heard it. This man's story wasn't just authentic. It represented the best traditions of military service and sacrifice. "Lieutenant Stevens," Crawford said, turning back to the young officer, "in your military education, did you study the concept of honor above all?" "Yes, sir," Stevens replied, beginning to understand where this was leading. "And what does that mean to you?" Stevens thought carefully before answering. It means doing what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular. Exactly, Crawford said. Now, I want you to consider something. Your orders were designed to ensure the dignity and security of this ceremony. Does preventing General Harrison's closest military friend from attending serve either of those purposes? The lieutenant felt his certainty crumbling. Everything he had been taught about military values pointed toward honoring Morrison's relationship with the deceased general, yet his training in following orders remained strong. Sir, I understand the moral argument, but my specific instructions— Your specific instructions, Crawford interrupted, his voice now carrying the full weight of ultimate military authority, come from me. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I am modifying those instructions right now. The gathered crowd fell silent as Crawford continued. Mr. Morrison, you will take your rightful place in the front row. Lieutenant Stevens, you will personally escort him there and ensure he receives full military courtesy. Stevens felt relief wash over him. The decision had been taken out of his hands by the highest possible authority. Yes, sir, he said with evident gratitude, but Crawford wasn't finished. Furthermore, he announced, his voice carrying across the entire gathering, when we reach the flag ceremony, Mr. Morrison will receive the flag from General Harrison's casket. It is my determination that no one present has earned that honor more than the man who saved our fallen general's life and remained his friend for 7 decades. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. General Harrison's widow, who had been watching from the front row, stood and approached Morrison with tears in her eyes. You must be Jimmy, she said, taking his hands in hers. Bob talked about you all the time. He said you were the bravest man he ever knew. Morrison struggled to speak through his emotions. He was a good man, Mrs. Harrison. The best friend a soldier could have. Lieutenant Stevens, now fully understanding the magnitude of what had almost happened, approached Morrison with new respect. Sir, it would be my honor to escort you to your seat. I apologize for not understanding the situation sooner. No apology needed, son, Morrison replied kindly. You were doing your duty as you understood it. That's what good soldiers do. As the ceremony proceeded, Morrison sat in the front row between General Harrison's family members, his presence adding a dimension of history and authenticity that no amount of protocol could have provided. When the honor guard began the flag-folding ceremony, the symbolism was profound. The flag that had draped General Harrison's casket was being prepared for the man whose courage had made the general's long and distinguished career possible. When Crawford personally handed Morrison the folded flag, the elderly veteran's tears flowed freely. He clutched the flag to his chest and whispered words that only he and his departed friend would ever know. Later, as the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Lieutenant Stevens approached General Crawford. Sir, I learned something important today about the difference between following rules and understanding their purpose. Crawford nodded approvingly. That's the difference between a good soldier and a great leader, Lieutenant. Rules exist to serve honor, not the other way around. Never forget that. Morrison, still holding the flag, stopped by Stevens before leaving. Young man, you showed respect for duty and authority today. That's admirable. But remember, sometimes the greatest duty is knowing when to question orders that don't serve the greater good. As Morrison walked slowly toward his car, supported by members of General Harrison's family who insisted on driving him home, the entire gathering understood they had witnessed something special. They had seen how rigid adherence to protocol could conflict with deeper military values, and how true leadership sometimes required the courage to choose honor over bureaucracy. Lieutenant Stevens returned to his duties with a new understanding of what it meant to serve. He had learned that military excellence wasn't just about following orders. It was about understanding the principles those orders were meant to protect and having the wisdom to recognize when those principles required flexibility rather than rigidity. The story of the lieutenant who almost turned away a hero and the generals who ensured that honor prevailed became part of military folklore. It served as a reminder that the greatest military virtue isn't blind obedience, but the courage to do what's right when the stakes matter most. Morrison kept General Harrison's flag on his mantelpiece until his own death 3 years later, and in his will, he donated it to the Military Museum, where both men's story is now told to inspire future generations of soldiers to understand that brotherhood, loyalty, and honor transcend any list or protocol ever written.